Hi, my name is James Maxey. I'm an author here in Hillsborough, North Carolina. I've written over 20 novels, and uh, little by little, I've been getting them the books that have been in print in an ebook format. I have been having them recorded and released as ebooks through Audible. And to do this, since I neither have the time nor the talent to record my own books, I work with professional narrators that I meet through a forum or through an online platform called ACX. ACX is owned by Amazon, and they're strongly affiliated with Audible. So it is a way that that authors and narrators can get their works out through Audible, which is currently the biggest online distribution platform for audiobooks. So I'm going to introduce my three narrators, starting in the order with which I've worked with them. So first up, I'm going to have Jake Urry say hi.
Hello.
So Jake has recorded 4 books for me so far, starting with Great Shadow, the first book of my Dragon Apocalypse, and he went ahead and did all 4 books in that series, and now he's going back and recording Bitterwood from my Bitterwood series, and hopefully I will have many more audiobooks from him within the next few years. Next up, I'm going to introduce Emerson Hardy. We say hi. I think Emerson, you are probably the newbie of the group. I think you've probably I think you're my book, Nobody Gets the Girl, I think was the very first audiobook you'd ever recorded.
Yes, it was.
Yep. And you've gone on to record 3 books, and you're working on a 4th. I was going to hold up a copy of Nobody, and I apparently have them all put in boxes, but he's also recorded a superhero or supervillain novel called Burn Baby Burn. It's actually one of my favorite performances by him. He's really a great narrator. You can probably hear from his voice. He has this kind of 1940s radio announcer that you would expect to be introducing the adventures of Superman. And the most recent narrator that I have had the pleasure of working with is Jason Burkhead. Jason has we've just released Bad Wizard. This is my sequel to The Wizard of Oz. It's a steampunk take where Dorothy has grown up to become a reporter, and she's investigating the wizard, who is now Secretary of War for Teddy Roosevelt and is planning to invade Oz with a fleet of heavily armed zeppelins. Jason, this is the first book I've worked on with him, but you've got quite an extensive catalog. You've got how many books total now?
I'm not sure.
It's got to be at least 30. It seemed like from your page. Although a lot of them looks like they're short, informational, how to do woodworking and stuff. So.
Yeah, more recently is when I've been starting to get more like fantasy books. So over the past few years. So.
Okay. Well, before the for the last couple of weeks, the library has announced that this is going to be having, and so readers of their website have put up some questions, and so I'm going to read some of these questions, and you can feel free to jump in any order if you feel like you've got a good answer. So the first question that people are asking is, when you're going to record an audiobook, do you read the book in its entirety before you record it to get a sense of the characters and the story, or do you just dive right in?
I narrow it down. I'll read the chapters first, the whole book.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to skim through to get a general feeling for the entire book, and then
as I'm going chapter by chapter, go through the chapter, make sure you know which characters are coming up, and what voices you've got to do, if you've got to come up with new ones, that sort of thing.
I mostly I'll read the synopsis. And then I just start diving in, and I really like to come up with the characters organically. So most of the time, I'll wait until I hit that character and see what springs forth. The only time a man gets to give birth, what I create.
So I had a friend named Greg who was a theater major in college, and he could pick up any book and start reading it, and it always sounded just so natural, as if he had read this book and practiced it 100 times, even if it was the first time he encountered it. Have you all possessed this talent always, or is it a skill that you've really had to work to develop?
I was by chance listening to some of my earliest recordings the other day, and I can tell you for sure that it's not something that I've always had the ability to do. So as soon as I left uni, I bought a really cheap microphone and did some demo recordings, and I listened back to them the other day, and it's sort of 5 or 6 years old, not that long ago, but I find it. I kept them for posterity's sake, but I really wanted to delete them.
How about you, Jason? Have you?
Well, for me, so I actually have a theater background first, and I feel like a lot of when it comes to cold reading comes down to confidence. To when you're reading it, just take hold and own it, and that's definitely something that takes a while to develop. I too have listened to some of my older stuff, not too recently. Those scars. But you can definitely tell the difference between when you're starting and you're gaining that confidence in your abilities to do this kind of work, and years down the road, and you're just knocking it off, and you're going through so many auditions in a day. It's not so much that you're so concerned about if you got or didn't get that last book, because you've got to work on so many other things that you can't waste that time thinking about it.
And Emerson, I think that you told me like the very first time that we met that people were always telling you that you had the sort of voice that you should be on the radio or recording audiobooks.
Yes, I've always gotten. The teachers always liked me in grade school. I never did theater. I never studied it in any formal capacity. I guess the hidden talents. I can't sing to sing myself, but I guess I can talk.
Well, your audio is a little bit choppy there, but I think I got the gist of it. It's funny that you've mentioned going back and listening to your old messages or to your old recordings and sort of like cringing at your early efforts. Nearly every book I have recorded is a book that I've written at a minimum of 5 years ago. And in the case of Nobody Gets the Girl in Bitterwood, very close to 20 years ago. And so when I listen to these stories, quite frequently I've completely forgotten them. I mean, I might remember the big picture, but I won't remember the line by lines. And so I'll be surprising myself, with either A, how good it is, or B, man, why did I go on about this so much? In Jason, and when you recorded Bad Wizard, I think you can probably tell that I did a lot of research on the construction of Zeppelins.
Yeah.
Because there's this one chapter where when I wrote it, it's probably like 2 paragraphs, but it's like, gosh, I spent a lot of time talking about the design of Zeppelins here. I probably should have edited some of that down, but
I think it will, the overall structure now. Like, there's a lot of technical aspects in that book. So
yeah. Well, there's always that balance of you want enough to make it plausible, but not so much to make it boring. And hopefully, I didn't go too far into the boring. But I definitely, if I were writing the book now, I would probably dial back on the number of times I say the word magnolium.
yeah, that's messing me up the first couple times.
All right. Well, the next question that a reader has asked, or a library patron has asked, is how long does it take y'all to record or narrate a page of text?
One page?
Yeah, I suppose that's an arbitrary standard, but if let's say let's go with a larger quantity here. Let's say that a typical chapter or short story would be about 5,000 words. So about how long would it take you to record a chapter?
Well, for me, I like to set aside when I'm trying to figure out how long it's going to take me from start to finish of a book. I take the number of chapters, and normally a chapter will take anywhere from 30 minutes to record to 45 an hour. It just depends on if it's like a longer chunk that I'm going through, and how many times the character's talking in it versus how much description's in there. But yeah, definitely less than an hour.
Okay. How about you, Jake?
I would say generally about the same, but the James Maxey chapters that I've done tend to be a little bit longer than most of them. I think that's kind of a general rule with epic fantasy, isn't it? But
yeah,
if I'm out of the booth within an hour and a half, I consider it. I've done a good job. Usually it's up to 2 hours, especially if there's a lot of dialogue. But generally, with shorter chapter books, it can be sort of half an hour, 45 minutes, and then have a break and go back in.
Well, Emerson, you lucked out getting to do the superhero books, because I deliberately make those chapters under 3,000 words. So how long does it typically take you to get through a chapter?
Of the superhero books, 30 minutes.
Okay. I know that in the new book you're recording for me, it's a short story collection, and some of those short stories are like 7,000 and 8,000 words long, and it's coming out to being 40 or 50 minutes of audio. So do those take you like 90 minutes or so to record?
Yeah, usually an hour
Okay.
to 90 minutes raw audio.
All right. Well, Jake, you mentioned going into the booth, and that is actually another question that someone has asked. Is this something that you're doing in a studio or you're doing at home?
I moved house last year. I'm currently at my parents'. This is a kind of weird situation, obviously, with Corona, but where I recently moved to, I happen to have a spare room, which is fantastic because I've just turned the entire room into a kind of giant vocal booth. Whereas previously I've had to set up a little area in the corner of my bedroom or whatever. So, but it's something that most people can do with just throwing some bed sheets over, some sort of frame, and you can start recording, and it sounds okay. Depending on what sort of outside noises you've got. But that's kind of where I started, and then I built it up to being able to go, okay, now I've got this whole room to play with, which is it's a bit more fun and feels a bit freer.
Well, I know that you've worked with so it's addressing this specifically to Jake. I know that you've worked also with instead of just working directly with authors, you've worked with a publishing house. And so did they send you to a studio, or did they still have you work from the home studio?
Yeah, that was in-house. It was kind of a strange one because it was a local company for me. It's a global sort of games, tabletop games producer, games workshop, and they have their factories and everything, and then they have a publisher basically in the factory as well, with a little recording studio built in. So I was in there with them, and that was done over a more kind of strict schedule. So it was 4 days in there, reading at a kind of 9 to 5 sort of daily structure, which was a bit of a struggle for me because I normally start recording at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That's how I sort of do it. But yeah, it was a much more sort of formal experience. I had to be very well prepared. Spent a couple of weeks preparing the whole manuscript.
Did they give you much direction as, make this voice deeper or make this character more sultry?
Very, very little. The one thing that I can remember them saying was there was a kind of a dwarf character, and they didn't want them to be Scottish because that was one stereotype too far. It was like a fantasy kind of Lord of the Rings thing. So yeah, that was one thing I wasn't allowed to do. I had to make them Yorkshire at very short notice.
So I do want to give Emerson and Jason a shot at answering this, but I do want to mention that since you've recorded a book for Games Workshop in a small world situation, Games Workshop was who owned Solaris, which put out my first fantasy novel, Bitterwood. So by the time Great Shadow came out, they had been sold to Rebellion, which was a different gaming company. But yeah, Games Workshop, we both have a linkage there.
Yeah,
so it's kind of weird.
Straight away as soon as I got the job.
So I know that Emerson and Jason, that you don't have you don't go into a studio, but you still work with other narrators or even just a spouse or a girlfriend who listens to your files and gives you advice on your performances?
Me and my wife.
Nope, the only partner I have is you.
All right.
Me and my wife tried doing something like that, and she got so bored sitting there waiting for me to finish with a chapter. So we don't do that. And she does a lot of crafting and artwork herself. So normally whenever I go back to record, she'll go into her room or her space and do a new painting or make some hats, or she does a lot of different things. Works in a bunch of different mediums.
Well, for my audiobooks, usually my wife is going to be listening to any chapter that you submit, but also, before I worked with any of you, I had an audition. I have to post an audition, and usually now I can just target one person, but it used to be the audition would be wide, and I would get 5 or 6 performances the first day I put it up. And so Cheryl would always listen to these auditions, and in all 3 of your cases, it was like, oh yes, that's the right voice, that's perfect. So it is good to have a second opinion on these things and not be flying completely blind with it. All right, so let me see if I can get a question that's not a variant of one that I've already asked here. So just, are there any tips or tricks that you follow to make it easier? I know that Jason, you have a click that you use?
Yeah, the click was actually a suggestion from, oh, who was that? Scott Brick, who is like really big in audiobooks. He does a lot for Penguin Random House. But yeah, he was suggesting in an interview that I was watching where every time that he makes a mistake, that's what he'll do if he's like recording from home. And that way he'll be able to track back through the audio and find all of his mistakes to edit out. So I just do like a, it took me a little while before I started doing that though, because I had a little clicker thing that I was
Right.
doing and it was just annoying. And then I tried doing a little like a ting on a metal thing, and I was like, well, that's stupid. Tried doing like snaps. That started hurting my finger because I was doing one where there was a lot of tongue twisters, names that weren't real names, so I had to remember how they were supposed to be pronounced based on how the author had envisioned the names. So eventually I was just like, that works. I'm good.
Right. Jake Urry, any tips or tricks for people wanting to do this at home?
I actually use the same click system thing. I do that sometimes, and then there's a system called punch and roll, which is where you're sort of on the computer at the same time, and you kind of edit as you go. So when you make a mistake, you sort of punch it in and then start recording again. I find though with fiction in particular, it can be quite distracting, and I don't like using that system. Although it's recommended over the clicking system by a lot of people, but I do fall back on the clicking system just because I can get into the book more, if you know what I mean. I'm not distracted by trying to use a piece of technology at the same time.
Right.
For like non-fiction or something, where you don't have to be as sort of dramatic, you can be doing that, I guess. But I like that feel of just going along more naturally and just clicking. I do the finger clicking. I don't know. It does hurt sometimes if you really get stuck on something.
How about you, Emerson? How do you mark the places where you want to go back and revisit and re-record?
Sometimes it's whistling, like really sharp whistling,
Okay. All right.
just so I can see the audio spike.
Okay. Excellent. So, how much? Speaking of having to go back and edit, let's say that you spend an hour recording a chapter. Typically, how much time then do you spend editing and processing that chapter before you feel like it's ready?
Oh, I can go through the chapter really quick when I'm editing, as long as I know where the problems are. Like I'll just slide through, and then I can listen to it without all the mistakes in it. And that's when I can start hearing, well, this voice changed a little bit here, or I kind of stumbled over this section. Let me just re-record that.
All right. All right. So, Emerson, how long do you normally spend editing versus recording?
Editing takes around 3 hours, depending, because sometimes they can be really mistake heavy chapters that long, or I don't really have a speedy way of doing it.
Okay. When we were organizing this, I asked if y'all would be interested in doing just a short reading to give people a sample of your style. Did anyone prepare a little snippet they want to read?
I got mine.
All right. Why don't you go for it?
I got the opening of Nobody.
All right. Go for it.
Prologue. A damn fine act of terror. Seattle burned. The night sky smoldered a hellish red as flames reflected off dust and steam. The horrible smoke rendered most senses useless. People stumbled over debris on the sidewalk, unable to see through teary eyes. The fumes burned their lungs and filled their mouths and noses with a sickening chemical stench of burning carpet. There were too many noises. People were screaming. Sirens and alarms blared over the waterfall roar of the inferno. Glass shattered and crashed upon the city streets. And above it all, explosions.
Very nice. And this is how he sounds every day. I've met him many times at cons, and
I talk real loud, so.
Jason or Jake, you have anything?
Yeah, do you want to go?
Oh, no, you can go first.
Okay. I'll go in the middle. Vendeverick stood before the trio of sun dragons, juggling a white ball of flame between his foretalons. "All fire is subservient to my will," he said, allowing the crackling orb to fade into a coal-black lump, which he crumbled to dust. Though he didn't mention it, light was also Vendeverick's plaything. The wizard bent light in a dozen subtle ways to enhance his appearance. The sky-blue scales of his hide glistened like wet gemstones. The diamonds that studded his wings cast rainbows with every movement. The silver skullcap that adorned his brow was wreathed in a shimmering halo. Vendeverick hoped to impress the king by looking more like a being from another world than a humble sky dragon. "Your so-called magic has an odor to it," said Zanzaroth, the sun dragon who stood behind the king. "It reminds me of the scent of a storm. It smells like trouble." And that's from Tornado of Sparks, which is a short story before Bitterwood takes place.
That was very nice.
Too good.
All right, Jason, you want to follow up with that one?
I don't know if I want to follow that one. Hang on. I had one where I was like, oh, I really want to do that one because it's a lot of interaction. And then I was like, oh, no, now I wanted to do one with more of an obscure voice. So I guess I'll at least find one with like the lion or something in here. You know the law. The lion roared back. Men are not meat. They smell like meat. The Caladad growled. They bleed like meat. They're protected by my decree, said the lion. Do you dare defy me? There's no decree preventing me from making a meal of you, said the Caladad, its eyes narrowing. You're welcome to try, the lion answered coolly, locking eyes with the larger beast. Asau suspected the lion was a goner. While the lion was bigger than any Asau had ever seen in a traveling show, the Caladad was twice its size. The bear-like beast wouldn't have it easy in the ensuing fight, but would certainly prevail.
I
That was
really
bad,
like
wizard.
that. Thank you. Yeah, I'm just amazed by all of your abilities to switch between characters and the standard narration so flawlessly. It really what inspires you? How do you find such range?
I think a lot about how a character is going to move, or what their mannerisms are going to be. With the Scarecrow, I even thought of just kind of like that dopey kind of moving his hands around a lot. Well, if only I was smarter, I might have found a way to do that. Um, and with the lion, you just got to have like that. It's a big creature. He's trying to sound a lot stronger than what he really is in the end. So he's gonna overcompensate with that dark, kind of deeper, aggressive kind of voice. And then with the wizard, it was old man, not minister, sinister old man. So, and he was a performer. So I just started thinking, well, he's just kind of talking, and he knows that what he says is going to have that overall gravitas and control over his audience. So he doesn't have to raise when he doesn't want to. Next.
Very nice. Yes, next.
I would say it's hard work coming up with voices for your books in particular, James, but it's more rewarding because there's such big characters and they're so vibrant. It's when you find the voice that you want to use for that particular character, you think, okay, I want to keep that. I want to use that again in something else, and then you start to sort of develop a little bit of a library, and there's 300 characters from different things that I've done, so I can bring this one out of the hat and put it in this book. And I invented a lot of different voices for Great Shadow in particular, and they've cropped up throughout other things I've narrated. But yeah.
So, just out of curiosity, if I were to listen to another book, might I hear an infidel voice in another work of yours?
You might do, yes. Generally, the sort of the protagonist characters, so I guess like Infidel, Stagger, etc. You don't want to make them too vibrant or outlandish. That's something that I try to be aware of, because you've got to, particularly like if it's a first-person narration, you've got to think somebody's listening to this for sort of 12 hours, 13 hours. So the main protagonist is kind of the blank slate voice, and then other characters that crop up can be, a lot more vibrant, more eccentric, and you kind of look forward to when they come up in the book. So, yeah. But there may very well be a few voices from Great Shadow that have appeared in probably in that Games Workshop book that I did, to be fair.
All right. How about you, Emerson? What's your process for finding the voices of different characters?
I play a lot of video games, and video game voices are usually pretty over the top, and I can get away with that in the superhero series especially. And so I just kind of try and pick up on the subtleties of, a voice actor and see, how could I do a similar character? What kind of character are they playing? And then just kind of go with it. If I have, the basic idea of, what does a superhero sound like? What does a villain sound like? Almost all my voices are based off of a particular actor in some way, and I could probably go back and name them if we had the time.
All right. So one thing that I've always liked about all of your works, but I really noticed it for you, Emerson, is you have such this natural, deep, kind of manly voice, and yet you really do a great job of bringing the female characters to life in these stories. So I will ask all of you, since all of you have fairly deep voices, how easy is it to slip into the voice of a female character or a child. I know some of you have had to do chimps and field mice. What are the challenges and rewards of doing so?
Breathing. Breathing is the hardest part, because female voices tend to be more breathy, and being efficient with that is difficult. But it's with practice and doing it over again, it becomes easier.
I don't normally think of it as trying to do a female voice, because I always feel like if I try to do a female voice, it's gonna come out really weird. So what I try to do is I just kind of just slightly heighten how my normal speaking voice, and then I try to think of more of the attitude of the character. Is this more of a sassy kind of attitude, or is she more of a brainy, book smart kind of? We want to make everything short and still kind of come up in those higher tones. But I try not to think of it too much as coming up with a girl's voice, unless it's like an evil witch where
you're trying to just think of a voice. Yes, like this. I'm going to get you and put you into my pot. Oh, yes.
Excellent. All right, Jake?
I'd agree with that, actually. Yeah, it's I think if you try to do a kind of high-pitched squeal or something, it's not going to sound natural. So I just tend to think what the kind of speech patterns like instead. Or I think because I don't really think about that anymore, but when I first started out, I think I was kind of basing the female voices on audiobooks that I'd listened to and what male narrators had done for their female characters that I'd appreciated, because there are a lot of examples out there of male narrators who do these kind of, for every female character that comes up, they're sort of really high pitched, and it takes you out of the story, and it's really off-putting and a bit offensive sometimes. But yeah, like what Jason said, I think it's fine to do that for particularly eccentric characters and stuff like that, but just kind of the women are just people, aren't they? So we all there's no need to try and sort of sound like some different kind of animal or something. Yeah.
And I think in the series you recorded, especially Jake, for the book you're currently working on, Bitterwood, really only has 2 or 3 female characters with a lot of dialogue. But in the Dragon Apocalypse, by the time you get to Cinder, the cast is basically like 8 women all talking to one another, and there's you'll go for 3 or 4 pages before you hit a single line of dialogue from one of the male characters. All right. All right, let's see if I've got another question here that is a variant, or that a lot of the questions boil down to like, how do you do it? How do you become a narrator? I will go. I'm going to just ask my own because one of you mentioned listening to other people's books and sort of listening to their voices. I'll ask all of you, who are some of your favorite narrators and or favorite audiobooks that where you sort of really kind of fell in love with the format? Have I put you on the spot?
So for me, I don't. So I do listen to some audiobooks, mostly out of research. But the audiobooks that stand out to me are really from my childhood. I remember listening to like on those old 45 records, the audiobooks where you heard it was like read along, you hear a chime and you're supposed to turn the page. And then also I had one growing up where it was on a cassette. We're progressing through time here. I wasn't even alive when the record ones were made. But the Mouse and the Motorcycle, I had listened to as a child so much that the tape had worn out. And there wasn't anything particular about the narrator's voice or the voices that he would turn it into. It's the emotion that you could hear behind when the mouse is trapped in the hamper and he's got to chew his way through linens to get out. Or even the excitement of when he first rides the motorcycle and he gets the little ping pong helmet. And like that always excited me. But other audiobooks, I mostly listen to them out of research.
All right. If I know, I'll shift it a little bit because I know Emerson. I don't know if you listen to a lot of audiobooks, but I do know that you're a fan of voice performers because I remember at one convention you specifically said that you were going to go get the autograph of I think maybe Greg Sipes.
Stephen Bloom.
Okay. So, who are some of your favorite audio performers from like animation or other things?
As far as animation goes, definitely Stephen Bloom and Jennifer Hale. Most of my female voices have been directly inspired by Jennifer Hale. I think she's just so perfect. Audiobook-wise, though, I think I speak for everyone when I say Scott Brick. He's like the king of audiobooks currently. Roy Dautrice as well, R.I.P. Tara Strong is another prolific female voice actor who I've borrowed a lot from. Tom Kenny, obviously. Just little bits and pieces from a lot of the modern day greats that I've seen in so many performances, be it audiobooks or animation, and there's overlap between the two as well. So I don't know, everyone that everyone's probably familiar with.
So, did you get to see Kevin Conroy on the Crisis on Infinite Earth get to play a live action Batman?
I did not, fortunately.
I only got to see the pictures. I remember he was talking about the experience though at a convention that I was at, where he was talking about having to go and get the body scan done for all the CG stuff. And he was talking about it being really awkward, kind of going into a creepy room that doesn't actually seem like it should be professional.
Yeah, it was. I thought it was interesting whenever I watched him because his voice is an animation. It is so Batman. It is just like so perfectly Batman. But watching it coming out of a living body, it didn't sound like Batman anymore. Even though I bet if I had like watched with the screen turned off, it would have sounded exactly the same. How about you, Jake? Do you have any favorites?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess I started listening to audiobooks similar to what Jason said when I was a kid. So I can remember a tape of the Gummy Bears that we had in the car, and it had that little chime at the end where you turn it over and you rewind it with a pencil. But then I sort of had this break, and then I got back into audiobooks when Audible became a thing. It was around the time I went to uni to train as an actor, and I just happened to get one of the greatest books ever written as an audiobook, and it was 1984, and that was the start of my kind of professional interest in audiobooks. So for a few years I was like, I would love to do this as a job, but I will never be able to. And then after graduating, I discovered ACX and got into it pretty easily. So it went from being this unattainable goal to just happening. But it was, I think that was Samuel West who narrated that edition of 1984, which has been done by many, many people over the years. And then, don't cut me off here, but I'm part of the Harry Potter generation. Not the films, but the books. I know like the back of my hand. But there were two kind of, I shouldn't have done this, but I saw them as kind of competing versions. So there was the UK version, which was by Stephen Fry, and the US version, which was confusingly narrated by a British actor called Jim Dale. Which I preferred that version because I thought I love Stephen Fry. I think he's got a fantastic voice. I could listen to him all day. In fact, I'm listening to him right now, listening to him narrate Sherlock Holmes stories, which does take all day because they're long. But I can remember just thinking, what's Stephen Fry doing with this particular chapter of Harry Potter, and what's Jim Dale doing with this, and how are they doing it differently? And thinking, how would I do it? And that was a kind of big part of me, thinking about audiobooks. And I guess I started practicing then reading Harry Potter out loud and doing all the different voices, and then, moved on to other stuff. But I just have to defend Harry Potter a little bit. If it wasn't for that, I wouldn't have been interested in reading anything else. So if it's the one thing for the world, it's got a lot of people interested in reading other stuff as well.
So, Emerson, I know that I Guess Nobody Gets the Girl was the first book you ever auditioned for. So this will actually be more for Jake and Jason. When you were first starting, how many auditions did you have to do before you finally landed a gig?
0. Yours was the first attempt.
I think for me, I really didn't do that many before my first one, but then there was quite a few between my first and my second. I probably had only done about a handful of auditions by the time I got my first one. It was a short story. It was a little, I don't know. There's some other kind of complications. The author ended up having all of his stuff. He pulled it all. I think it was just his initial marketing strategy wasn't very good, and I think he realized that afterwards. And it's because he titled his books to be a collection, but he was only releasing them one short story at a time. But it was really fun. I got to do like a full production on it. I made all the music for it. I had done sound effects because he wanted it to be kind of more like a radio play. So I got to be creative with that, and with the second one that I'd done for him. But then, it was a lot of auditions after that.
Excellent. How about you, Jake?
I think I sent off a kind of batch of auditions when I first signed up to ACX, and it's probably like 5 different things I auditioned for. I think I got 3 of them, and then panicked massively. I wasn't expecting to get anything, and then I had sort of 10 hours of audio to record when I'd only ever done a few minutes. But luckily the deadlines were far enough away for me to be able to figure out how to do it properly. But that was at a time when there weren't too many people on ACX. It's kind of exploded recently, and particularly now with a lot of actors working from home. So there weren't a massive amount of people on it. I'm talking like it was 20 years ago. It was only like 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah, back when like half the books were smut, right?
Yeah, exactly. Oh, dear.
It's a rule I've discovered as an author, is that if there's some new market and some new way of making money opens up, the early adopters who get in are like, oh, wow, this is great. And then there's going to be a certain time period after which there's going to be 100,000 other people all competing for the same existing pool of money. So I feel a lot of empathy for the increasing competition for the audiobook jobs. There's a lot of people think they can do it from home, and as three of you have proved it can be done. However, how much do you how I guess I shouldn't say how much you spend on your equipment, but are you all kind of techie, geeky audio nerds who drool over the specifications of your latest microphone?
No. My latest microphone I got out of I had forgotten my microphone at home when I was on a road trip to visit family, and I wanted to still be able to do some auditions while I was away. And so I went to the store, I bought a microphone that was on clearance, and it turned out to be better than the one that I was already using. So I just continued to use that one. I sold the old one so I could sold the old one and my old audio interface, got a new audio interface. But yeah, just so I can pay some bills.
Anyone else have a fancier setup?
I'm not massively tech savvy, and it does take me a while to sort of figure things out. But I did upgrade recently. At the end of this latest tax year, I had to find some legitimate business expenses. So I did get this new microphone and a new interface. But that was for about 3 years. I've been using a sort of reasonably affordable, kind of low to mid range microphone bundle, and it was fine. It did the job, but I just thought, have a bit of an upgrade and see if I can get used to using it. And luckily, I bought one that's quite easy to use and it works very well. Because a lot of the time, you buy a new bit of equipment and it takes forever to figure out how to use, or just develops problems that you can't solve. So. Yeah, I've only recently crept up the kind of from the low to medium to the medium range sort of equipment.
It doesn't really cost a lot to get like enough equipment to start on either. I mean, I think all of my original starting cost was like just over $100. Really wasn't that bad. The only thing is when you're working with cheaper equipment, you typically end up having to work a little bit harder with acoustics and like some of the post-processing work. Whereas when you get to a point and you can actually afford to invest back into your business and upgrade, you'll find that there's a lot less that you're having to make up for in the latter part. And you can actually just record, do the minimal editing, and then send it off.
All right. One tip that I had heard early on, I don't know if it's true or not, was I would try recording like podcasts and stuff on my home desktop computer, and it was always very buzzy. And someone told me that you should always record on a laptop on battery power, because then you don't have that transformer buzz. Is that actual advice, or was that just someone saying meaningless words?
I've never heard of that.
It could be true for sort of, computer microphones, maybe. There is, like, with different bits of equipment, you have to get the power level right. So it could be a thing.
I honestly, like, I did a lot of research before I even put $1 into any of my stuff. I didn't necessarily research the product specifically. I researched like all the troubleshooting before I even needed to actually work with the problems. So I already knew that I would need an actual analog microphone instead of using any of like the cheaper ones, just because in the long run you're dealing with more data coming from an analog microphone, and you can actually fix more with analog than you can with the digital ones. You can only do so much with the data off of a digital one.
All right. Well, excellent. So I guess we've used up our hour here. I know what some of your next releases are, but I'm not going to presume that I'm the only books that that you have going. So I'll close out by giving you each a chance to tell me about projects you're currently working on or books that you might have coming out soon.
Many, miny, mo.
Why don't you go first, Jason?
All right. So not only did Bad Wizard come out finally after ACX went through all of its time, took its sweet little time with that. But not only did that come out, but also a book called Flames of Valor by Ray Clark. I'm actually working on the second book in that trilogy, Fire Forged. That will probably be done within the next month and a half, and hopefully, as long as ACX approves everything through, probably be out in the next couple months. And then I've also I work with a series called Spectrum by Samantha Mina. She releases one book a year. The one for this year got released in March. That was the fourth book in the series, and I'm going to be working on recording the fifth book after Fire Forged, and that'll be out next year in March.
All right, sounds good. Now, when any of those books come out, make sure you send me links because I'll share them on my Facebook page and tweet about them. Presumably we've got at least a couple of people now for my fans who like your voice. So if it sells even just 2 or 3 books for you, it can't hurt to share the link. So how about you, Emerson? What you have coming out now?
Once we there is no wheel gets over and done with, I'm gonna start getting those business cards out there and just do the whole con routine again. And I want to try and branch off into some more diverse stuff, be it nonfiction or something technical, and see what happens in the time that it takes you to finish the 4th installment of Nobody. And we'll just see.
All right, sounds good. And how about you, Jake?
I'm currently working on a sequel to the first sort of novel I narrated, which was called The Cryptic Lines. And the sequel is called The Enigma of Heston Grange, and it's like a cozy British mystery sort of vibe. And also, bizarrely enough and fittingly enough, a book called The Last Plague. Which is,
Oh, that's awesome.
That's too real.
It is too real. Because my situation at the moment is I'm between my parents, which is where I am now, and then my home where I live alone, where my little studio is. So I was up there, and the situation was I had to narrate this book in the studio and then bring it back here to work on it. So I had to, the quicker I got it done, the quicker I got home, basically. So I was frantically narrating a book about a deathly end of the world plague as quickly as possible before I could come home in this kind of weird apocalyptic atmosphere where there's nobody on the road for 2 hours.
Well, hey, that's great motivation there.
Yeah. Oh.
We'll have to be careful about what your next project is. Don't narrate a book called "The Day the Comet Slammed into the World and Wiped out."
I know, well, it's bizarre. At the very start of this whole pandemic, I had to cancel a theatre show that I'd written myself that was called The Four Horsemen, and it was about the end of the world. So I don't know if this is all my fault or something, but these things
Jake,
keep
stop trying to kill us all.
I can only
You may have discovered your superpower there, Jake.
Yeah, I need to stop.
So I will also plug that Jake and I have 2 audiobooks pending. Jason had referred to that ACX is taking a long time to approve books right now, so we're on about a 2-month approval now for 2 books that we have submitted that are actually re-releases of the 4 Dragon Apocalypse novels. We've bundled the first 2 together as a book called Hearts of Frost and Flame, and the second 2 books are bundled together called Hell and Back. And it just happens to work out. The series really does exist as 2 duologies. The first 2 books have a single narrator, and the second 2 books basically follow a character named Sorrow, who's in the earlier books, but really kind of steps up and becomes the major protagonist later on. So you'll be able to get 2 books for 1 Audible credit, assuming ACX ever gets around to approving audio that they've already approved once. All right. Well, I want to thank you all for coming